Hello everybody, and welcome to today's session. We're going to talk about break free and migrating your Oracle and SQL Server databases to AWS. My name is Kathy Gibbs. I am a Senior Specialist Solution Architect here at AWS. So what we're first going to talk about is giving you that broad view. All right, we're going to start there and then we'll dive into the RDS instances with Oracle and SQL Server. So how do you get your data into AWS? What you'll do is start with down here that data movement. So you can use Database Migration Service, or we call that DMS, Snowball, or even Kinesis data streams to get your data into the AWS. The next place, if you notice here, we've got data lakes. So you can use S3 to store your data, all different types of data. And I can also use S3 to store files and load them into the databases as well. And then you can use Glue to be your data catalog for that data mart. And I can also use Glue for my ETL, my extract, transform, and load. The next level that we're going to go to here is the relational databases, which we'll be talking more about today. We also have other databases though. So you want to use the right tool for the job. And in this case, we can use NoSQL, we can use Reddit with Elasticache. We also have Neptune, which is a graphing database, and different databases that you can use. From here, the next thing you want to look at setting up is going to be that analytics portion. We're going to talk here, we've got Redshift that you can use, EMR, and Athena you can actually put on top of S3 for that data mart. Kind of the next level or the highest level there for us to talk through would be our BI, business intelligence, where you'd use QuickSight for. And then our next level is even using some of that machine learning. What can we learn from this data set? So you can see our AWS, we would like to say that people we work with are builders. So you can see how all of that builds on top of each other. So as I talked about, we like to have the right tool for the job. So this is a good way to kind of look at that. When we first built AWS and RDS specifically, we used our knowledge base and what we had learned with Amazon.com. In fact, a lot of people that created or helped create RDS started off with Amazon.com and used their experience. So that experience also helped us decide and to learn you want to use the right tool for the job. So you can see down here all of these 4 pictures are trucks, but I certainly wouldn't want to use this construction truck for hauling things over the United States, right? That's what I would use that. It's a good representation of what we're talking about here. So we have over 400,000 database instances on AWS, or customers that we use, the customer account. Some of these that I can pull out, you can see HBO, Duolingo's an app that I've started using. So this is just a small snippet of the customers that are on AWS working with databases and analytics. It's good to know that somebody's been there before, and you can build upon what they've learned. So relational database service. As I mentioned, some of the people that built RDS are people that came from Amazon.com. So that's when we first built this and we created that managed instance, there wasn't a lot of that, especially not on the cloud. We have multi-engine support for our RDS, or relational database service, that you can use in a managed fashion. With managed, what that really means is that we're automating the provisioning, the patching, scaling, and it also makes it nice because things like replication, disaster recovery, having a DR or HI site is easy to set up and easy for you to fail over to or switch over to when needed. We also have backups and restores, so we back up the database for you, and then in order to restore, you don't have to go find the logs somewhere. We provide that, so you can either do just a point and click using the console, or you can also use APIs to help you with that. So let's dive a little bit more into this. As we mentioned, there are different types of engines. So we do have the commercial, the Oracle and SQL Server, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. We have open source platforms, so MySQL, MariaDB, and Postgres. And then we also have that cloud native Aurora, where it's MySQL compatible and Postgres compatible. That's a little bit more enterprise ready than the open source one you get from community. So one more thing here before we dive deeper into RDS for Oracle and SQL Server. Managing your own database, it's not necessarily a competitive advantage anymore. So I know that when I was a DBA, at least 50% of my job was installing software and making sure everything worked, just that kind of repetitive that you could automate very easily. So it wasn't taking advantage of all of the architectural things that a DBA can do when you're just sitting there installing software. Same with configuration and patching. I know for backups, when I was a DBA, it was the first thing I did to make sure that the backups completed and that everything was okay there for my SQL Server instances as well as Oracle. You have to make sure your cluster is set up and that not only data replication is happening for your high availability, but that I can test that failover, right? And so that was a big thing for us and took a lot of time and a lot of planning involved with that. And then we'll talk about capacity planning. Certainly if I have a data center, it's very hard for me to shrink or grow on demand. So normally what I do is I set up my database to where it's at normal. My average is 40% CPU because I have to provision or have to peak, right? So I need to make sure I've got that room to grow, which means most of the time I'm only sitting at 40% utilization. So why use a managed system like RDS? Well, you have a lower total cost of ownership, so it's costing less money. And that managing the muck and what that means, you'll see more about what that means. What it allows you to do is focus on the things that not only differentiate you, but also differentiates your company, that you can spend a lot more time innovating. Okay? You have that built-in services that we mentioned. So even a small startup that may not have money to do things, you can get high availability, you can get that security, and we'll talk more in detail about that. So as a DBA, we can see here what AWS does now and what you don't have to worry about and what you can focus on, right? So again, you can see what I normally did. I was definitely this DBA that did all that patching and upgrades and software installation. So what AWS takes care of for you is we can do that automated failover. We'll talk more in detail about that. Backup and recovery. Again, you still have to test recovery and you still have to make sure that you've got that point in time, but we're going to handle those files for you. Security, right? All of this different information. So instead of fighting fires now, when a performance issue comes along, I can actually be involved in the architecture and the query optimization before it goes to production, saving myself a lot of time. And again, those heartaches or those headaches with the firefighting. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive deeper into Amazon RDS and talk about some feature highlights. So we'll talk at a high level, and then we'll go a little bit deeper with each of these. The first is highly available and durable. So on RDS, you do have those snapshots. That's for the backup. You also have that multi-AZ configuration, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about that and what that means for that highly available and highly durable. It's very scalable. That's one of the reasons you like to go to the cloud, so that I can scale my compute and my storage. You also have the ability to have read replicas to scale that out. The secure and compliance, encryption in transit and at rest, we do have that at AWS for RDS, as well as we've got compliance that we can follow, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail. So let's go ahead and do that now. So let's start with that durability. Automated backup. So when you first install RDS, by default, you'll get an automated backup that is for 7 days. This is where you do that point-in-time recovery. So we start with a default of 7 days, and we go to 35 days for your automated backup. On top of the automated backup, we certainly can do manual backups to help along with that, right? So we said here 35. What we do, and you can see over here on the right-hand side, is that once a day on a window that you choose, we do a full backup. And then we back up those transaction logs every 5 minutes so that you can do that point-in-time recovery. Okay. When you're running multi-AZ, and again, we'll explain that on the next slide in a little bit more detail, but when you have that, we will take the backup off of this standby. So there really isn't going to be any performance hit at all when you're doing that snapshot. Okay. You can do a cross-region snapshot, so in some cases that disaster recovery means that as long as I have my database up within a certain number of hours, I'm okay. In that case, you may just want to take your manual snapshot and move that to another region. Okay, let's talk about high availability now. So in our multi-AZ deployment, let me take a step back and explain that in AWS, we have a concept of regions and availability zones. So the regions are global, and within the regions, you have multiple availability zones. An availability zone can be a data center. In some cases, it can be a combination of data centers, but each availability zone is a different data center. What we do is we have them far enough apart that if there's something that goes wrong, say a flood, it would only affect one availability zone, but close enough together that we're talking single-digit millisecond latency between the two availability zones. So that's what we're talking about here when we talk about multi-AZ. If you notice, I have a load balancer, I have my web servers, and then my application servers. Now, this picture shows after there's already been a failover. So imagine that before the failover, this here is my production instance. So when there is a failover that happens, multi-AZ is synchronous and it is an automatic failover. So what will happen is if we do have a failure, it will fail over to the standby instance. It will promote that to be primary. And then if you notice, my applications will automatically point to that new primary that failed over standby. You also notice that once I am the primary, I will create another standby. So they'll always be in this configuration, that one primary and that one standby, and that will get built for you. The nice thing about this is that in order to set it up, I don't have to do a lot of software installations. When I'm in the console and I'm creating RDS, there's just a checkbox that says, do you want multi-AZ? And you say yes, and then you go along. So when you say here enabled with one click, it makes that really easy to set that up. The other thing that comes with multi-AZ is you can have this with your standard edition. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's a big bonus when we're talking about moving to the cloud and maybe saving some money where I can and not have to have enterprise edition in every place. Okay. The next section we'll talk about is scalability. So this is one of those reasons that a lot of people just go to the cloud to start with. This is that, and before with that, and we'll talk about, this is scaling vertically, right? So if I have that Black Friday or I have those times where I need more CPU power, sometimes this might happen during a large sporting event. Just coming up is going to be the Stanley Cup, so here in the States, so that you may need to increase or vertically grow, and you just do that through a couple of clicks or again through the API. On the console, you would just choose Instance Actions and Modify. You would change the class that you go to, and then I would click on Apply Immediately. Be careful when you do this, is because that would cause a bounce, so you want to make sure that you have everything set up when you click on that Apply Immediately. Okay. You can see here I also changed the storage at the same time. So, and if I want to change my storage type, I can do that as well as other things when I click on Modify. Okay. Now we talked about growing vertically. In this case, read replicas is when I want to grow horizontally. So one of the things that's going to help me with performance and as I scale and grow is that I can offload the traffic that's just reading to my read replica, and then I can keep that write traffic on my writer so that I can separate the performance, and what I'm doing, it will give me better performance on my writer because I've taken those reads and put them onto a read replica. So it's going to relieve that pressure, right, if I have that additional capacity. I can promote one of these read replicas. That's a manual process, just to note. So as before with the multi-AZ, that happened automatically. The read replicas, it would be a manual failover. This is why I always say it's good to have both multi-AZ and your read replicas. One for that failover that happens automatically, that's synchronous. And then your read replicas are asynchronous, and you can, that's an additional failover, an additional HA point, but you can also use that to offload that traffic. You can also have a read replica that is a different version, a different point version. So I may want to say, okay, I'm going to upgrade, or I'm going to have that, and then I'm going to fail over to that version and promote that to be now my writer, and my downtime is much lower. Okay. So in Oracle, in order to have read replicas, you do need to have an active data guard license. You can see for SQL Server, it uses that built-in distributed availability groups and the version that it's there. Okay, so the next part, which is probably the most important part, is security when we're talking about this. RDS instance is designed to be secure as default. At AWS, security is our job number one, and definitely what we drop everything for if there's an issue there. So you start with security in your virtual private cloud or your VPC, right? And I can have my firewall around that. I can have security groups, which are like a virtual firewall. Then I can use identity access management, which is where I've got resource level permissions. This will tell me who has the ability to maybe create a new instance, or if I want to give developers the opportunity, they could say, create an instance on a T3 micro or a T3 small, and I can limit that, right? So those are some of the things that IAM can do. We do have encryption at rest, so you can use the key management service, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. We do have that SSL that's available that you can protect that data in transit as well. So here are a couple compliance that we have. We do have a security area on our website, so a lot of these audit reports can be seen there. There are some that have to be under NDA, so as a customer, if you sign that, you can get those audit reports. But you can see here we've got SOX, we've got PCI, and even if you go and look over here like Singapore, MTCS. So globally, we're always looking for certifications that we can look into and our customers use. So that's something to bring up if there is one that you're aware of that isn't on that long list. This is just a snippet of what we have. So let's talk about that encryption and that KMS, or that key management service. So in this particular case, you'll see I start with a master key. Now, customers can bring their own master key here, or we can create one. But when you use KMS, it's a two-factor authentication. So we're going to have that master key, and we're actually going to use that to create other keys, that two-factor, to encrypt the data. Okay, and that's using AES 256. Okay, so what's good about having the KMS is you've got a centralized location. I know that when I did this before, I used the super secure method of an Excel spreadsheet that was just out there that people could see, but we had to have a place where we kept all of those thousands of keys. In this case, you've got just a couple that are your customer keys that you need to keep track of, and then those two factors created underneath that. You can run reports using KMS, right? So it's at centralized location. It is important to note that encryption cannot be removed once it's put on the database. If you needed to do that for whatever reason, you would data pump or move the data out into an instance that was not set up with encryption. Okay. If the source is encrypted, it makes sense. The read replicas have to be encrypted as well. And your backups are also going to be encrypted if you have your instance that's encrypted. Now, this last bullet point down here is important because if you're already using TDE for Oracle and SQL Server, you can in fact use that in AWS in your RDS instance. And you do that through option groups, and I'll show that to you in a couple slides that are coming up. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about optimizing that instance and also going into performance and monitoring. So one of the ways that I can optimize my instance type is what we were talking about, right? I want to right size the instance that I'm on. I don't want it to be too small because then I have performance issues, but I don't want it to be too large because then I'm overpaying. And that's one of the things we want to do is try to see where we can save you money. Lower memory, right? This is obvious with relational databases. A lower share buffer hit ratio, right? But we can also see here that there are times that I can play around with the memory. So maybe an M class, which is a general purpose instance, or I can use an R class, which is more memory optimized. I usually vote for the R class with relational databases, but it's whatever works best with your application. We can also look at different storage types. So GP2, you can save a little bit of money. Provisioned IO is for those OLTP transactional databases where I know that I need a certain kind of throughput. So if I need 10,000 IOPS, then I can set that up and I can provision that. Okay. So one of the common questions I get when moving to the cloud is, well, how do you tune the database? Is that something I do? Is that something you do? Well, what I usually tell people is that I actually follow the same steps. I just use different tools. Okay, so the first thing that I usually do is I'll take the hardware out of the mix, right? Go on my system, look at top. Then I might see if there's any processes that are running, again, on on-premise, I might look at top and look at those top processes. Then I'm going to look and see what the top wait events are and what are the top SQL statements that are running. Of course, I'm going to look at explain plans as well to see what my optimizer is doing and what my what direct path or what type of paths that my explain plan is doing for a particular SQL statement. So I do that same thing, and I just use different tools in AWS. So I start off with that whole how's the hardware. I'm going to look at Amazon CloudWatch metrics. Okay, so this is going to give me those CPU, that memory, that I/O that I would normally get if I'm looking at, say, top on a Unix system, or if I'm going to look at the Windows operating system. The next set is going to be, okay, take that out of the mix. Let me look at those processes. So if I enable enhanced monitoring, what that does is that CloudWatch metrics, by default, it captures 5 minutes. It will go down to 1 minute. As soon as I turn on enhanced monitoring, I can go down to a second level of detail for those metrics. So as soon as I turn that on, enhanced monitoring, I also get that process list. So that's what we're looking at here, right? I have that CloudWatch. Then my enhanced monitoring, you can see CPU by user. So it gives me those additional metrics when I turn on enhanced monitoring. And then here's my process list. So it shows me those top processes that are running in the system. Okay. We also integrate with third-party monitoring tools, so you can do that when you're running CloudWatch, and I can get that data into my monitoring tool if that's a company standard. So as I said, when I take those out of the mix, I look at wait events and I look at SQL statements. Well, we have a tool called Performance Insights, where it's going to show me in a graphical format what is going on, and I can see where my high bars or my top bars are, my top wait is. Right? So you can see here I've got a max CPU, but all of a sudden something came in and went over that. Well, that's where I want to look at the SQL statement. If somebody comes to me and says, hey, it's slow, that's stereotypical, right? So I can look and see the SQL statement that it's running. I can click on that, find out more information. I can also see the wait events that are associated with that SQL statement. So if there's a lot of locking, or if there's one particular user, I can look here by different users to see if one report is being run or something was kicked off at a time that it shouldn't have been. So it makes it real easy for me to see that information, show me where the bottleneck is, tell me that time that it's running, and investigate a particular SQL statement. What is it doing? What's the SQL that I'm running? So I can find out how to tune that. The other thing that's nice is having it in a graphical format is that it's easy to show and it's easy to explain to other people what's happening in the system. So I can say, look, this is where the problem was, there's that bar, and there's your SQL statement, right? Did something change? It looked like things changed if I go back in time. For Performance Insights, you can have 7 days that are free, and you can go up to 2 years. So if I want to see that month compared to a month or a quarter to quarter, I could do that if I purchase the 2-year option. Okay, so let's end with talking about some best practices to work with. The first is addition. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, where we're talking about enterprise versus standard. With these additional options that you have, such as multi-AZ, I can have high availability with a standard edition where I may not have been able to do that on premise, right? So I can do that multi-AZ, but I certainly can use my enterprise edition to have that read replica, right? To do all of those options that I have. You do have storage encryption that you don't need Enterprise Edition for if you use that key management service. Network encryption, SSO. And I have that CloudWatch and that enhanced monitoring, that Performance Insights, that typically, maybe for Oracle, you might want to have to purchase the diagnostic and tuning pack for. But here you can just stay on Standard Edition and still have all of these options. Okay. Parameters. So we didn't go too much into parameters and initialization. Just know that we do have an area that's for parameter groups, right? That I can have a default, and the default parameter group is available for every major version. So if I want to create my own or do a custom, say to increase processes, that might be one, then I create a custom parameter group. So some of those best practices around this, and this is one of those big things that you do as an on-premise DBA or developer, is that I want to limit the number of what I do for a parameter group. So a lot of different parameters, you can change at a session level instead of having hundreds and hundreds of different parameter groups out there, right? Huge pages is good in some of the instance types and some of the different versions for those instance classes that has that turned on automatically, but that helps you with memory, so that's something to look at. It is important to note that if you reboot without failure, it's just going to reboot that instance. And in some cases, you can see over here where I've got modifiable. If it says it's static or false over here, that means that you would have to reboot that instance in order for it to take effect. And you'd have to reboot without failover, because otherwise it would fail over to your standby or your read replicas if you had that, and you wouldn't be taking on those changes. Okay. Options is another thing. We have option groups. So this is an example for SQL Server. You can see I've got that TDE, my encryption server. Oracle, this is where you might set up OEM. So I might have a custom option group for all of my instances for Oracle because I have like an on-premise, maybe Enterprise Manager, and I want to set up an agent. So you can see here different types. I think of the difference between parameter groups and option groups is that in option groups, I kind of have to add something to the database. I'm not just changing a configuration. Okay. So configuration best practices, as far as I have set something up, the number one thing is that this is just a database that you're used to for SQL Server or Oracle. It's good to follow just your standard database best practices and know that, you know, a lot of things are not any different. Things like manage and monitoring space. You can automatically grow that, but that may be something that you want to manage on your own to look and see how that's going. You can set up alerts for that, so I can get alerted on different things, and I can even have actions if I want to off those alerts. That's in CloudWatch. So I can monitor my logs either in my database, or I can send my logs to CloudWatch, and sending them to CloudWatch saying, yeah, I want to see them over there, makes it so that I can alert off of what's in those logs. Okay, I can use either the console or the CLI. What I find most of the time is that people start in the console to get used to how to set up RDS, and then they start using the command line so that I can start packaging things up and maybe even automate installations or doing things. Okay, then we talked about as far as CloudWatch logs. As I mentioned, the next thing to do is to automate. So I've got my console, I've already figured out. Now I want to create an automation and use that command line, that CLI, to make it so that, you know, I can, here's my production instance, here's a development instance. I can script out how to create that, put the boundaries that I want to, and then I can put that in System Manager so that people can automatically create that, or I can use CloudFront templates to do that as well. So you can see here that it's just an example of the command line. RDS describe my instances for a particular region, and it will list out the instances that I have. It's a great way to capture what versions, as you can see here, what versions that I have across all of my instances for a region. And for that, I thank you very much, appreciate your time, and have a great day.